Haidamai, welcome. You're listening to People, Planet, Food, conversations about the food, fibre and biomaterials system that I hope are both a cause for optimism and a call to action. I'm Roger Robson-Williams, Chief Sustainability Officer at the Plant and Food Research Group of the Bioeconomy Science Institute. I'm interested in understanding what a sustainable bioeconomy looks like, and in this podcast series, I talk to a wide range of people who've got something interesting to say about this. In this episode of People, Planet, Food, I'm really excited to be talking with Iain Lees-Galloway. He's the General Manager at the Aotearoa Food Rescue Alliance and somebody who I've had the pleasure of working with on a specific project that no doubt we'll talk about. Greetings, Iain.
Good morning, Roger. Thanks for having me along.
Really good to see you this morning. So, for the benefit of listeners, the Aotearoa Food Rescue Alliance, which we'll probably refer to as AFRA by its acronym, is a charity with the vision to create a future where no food is wasted and no one who needs food goes without it. It works towards this vision by helping to build the capacity and capability of food banks in Aotearoa and also food rescue and community food services. Iain's a former government minister, and prior to joining AFRA, he was lead organiser and then associate industrial services manager at the Nurses Union. Iain's passionate about empowering people through collective action and delivering awesome outcomes for all of the stakeholders. So, Iain, that's my kind of little précis of who you are, but perhaps you could explain a bit in your own words who you are and how you've landed up as the general manager at AFRA.
I've had the privilege of a career focused on advocacy, on trying to bring about good change through collective action. And that's manifested through getting involved with the Student Association when I was at university, my work with unions, obviously being a member of parliament and government minister. And I was looking for an opportunity to carry on doing that work, working with membership organisations, helping people to access the political system and lobby for good outcomes and good decisions from the political system. But I suppose as I've gotten older and the more I've been exposed to what the issues of the day are and the general direction of travel that we're going in as a society, I realised that unless we figure out our management of the environment and our relationship with the environment and understand ourselves as human beings as being part of the environment, then all these other things that we're talking about are kind of moot. If we ruin the environment and it is unable to sustain future generations of human beings, then what's the point of everything else that we do? So I started looking for work in the environmental space, being very aware of the fact that I had no background or qualifications in anything to do with environmental work. And I was just very lucky to come across a part-time contracted role with AFRA, the Aotearoa Food Rescue Alliance. I had some knowledge of what food rescue is because there's a food rescue organisation here in my local community. Happens to have been founded and run by someone I went to university with. And of course, I had a relationship with them as the local member of parliament. And so I just, I thought, gosh, this would be a really interesting opportunity to step lightly into the environmental space while still maintaining the focus on social justice and reducing inequality, which has been a large part of my career. So food rescue, was just a great opportunity. Started off doing some contractual work, mostly focused on government relations and helping the alliance with its work to access government organisations and conversations with ministers, etc. And I found I was loving it so much that it turned into a permanent role. And then about 18 months ago, the opportunity came up to take on the general manager role. So, which I was very lucky that the board allowed me to step into that role. So from really kind of searching for an opportunity, finding one, and then discovering probably an even greater love for the work than I was expecting. Now I'm really do have the privilege of being able to go around and tell people the story of food rescue and what a wonderful job it's doing.
Thanks for sharing that journey in, and I think it's really interesting that right from the kind of beginning of this conversation, you've gone for the jugular of, in the sense of, the importance of our relationship with the environment. That if thinking about it from my sort of world, as it were, the bioeconomy is entirely dependent on a healthy environment, on a stable biosphere, but also weaving in that social justice piece, which is so connected to issues related to environmental degradation. So we're talking specifically this morning, although we could talk about all sorts of things, I'm sure. Thinking specifically here about food rescue, and I guess I'm interested in who who are you rescuing food for?
Well, our definition of food rescue is taking surplus food that would otherwise go to waste, or it is at least at risk of going to waste, and redistributing it to people in need at no cost to the end user. So, who are we rescuing food for? It's people experiencing food insecurity. In other words, people who are hungry and don't have the means or the access to food in the way that most of us are able to access it. So most of us can use our incomes to go to the supermarket, buy food, or we might be growing a little bit of food for ourselves in our backyards or whatever. But there's an increasing number of people, for a variety of reasons that I've no doubt we'll get into, who are not able to access food from the commercial free market system that we have. And so food rescue is a way of taking that surplus food that is very much at risk of ending up in the landfill or at best becoming pig food and using it for its original intended purpose, which is to feed people, specifically people who are experiencing food insecurity.
Thanks, and I am really interested in circling back to the environmental side of this, and quantities of food that end up being wasted and the implications of that and so on. But before we get onto that, what scale of food insecurity are we talking about in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
So about 1 in 5 people, 20% of people experience some form of food insecurity. And that means that they sometimes or often are hungry because they can't access food. So 1 in 5, and that's a million people in New Zealand each year experience some level of food insecurity. And in families with children, it's 1 in 4. So 1 in 4 of our kids is sometimes or often hungry because their family is not able to put food on the table. Which I think, if you stop and think about it for a moment, is an extraordinary figure. And the repercussions of that are profound. If we think about educational achievement, likelihood of coming to the attention of the police or the justice system, health outcomes, so many of those are determined by things like, have you got a roof over your head and have you got food on the table? And to know that 1 in 4 of our kids are growing up in a household that regularly experiences hunger, really tells us a lot about where we should be focusing our attention if we're genuinely interested in dealing with some of those downstream effects.
Okay, thank you for that. That is a lot of people. I guess I'm interested in understanding across the organisations that are members of the Aotearoa Food Rescue Alliance, how many people get helped one way or another in a year? Any
Oh,
idea?
um, it's a hard number to put our finger on, and one of the things about our work is that we are really trying to increase the database, and so we've got some numbers that can help tell the story and help us quantify the scale of the problem and where we should be putting resources. So very, very difficult to put a number on how many people we are helping. But what I can tell you is that in the year to the 30th of June this year, our members rescued and redistributed over 10 million kilograms of food. And if you think that, you translate that into number of meals, that's tens of thousands of or hundreds of thousands of meals that are being distributed to families. So, and that need is increasing. The demand, we cannot meet the level of demand that we see out in the community. So, yeah, we know that even though we're doing that work, and I'd imagine those numbers sound quite extraordinary to people, that is still not meeting the level of demand that we see out in our communities.
So I'm guessing if you've got a reasonable handle on the quantity of food that is being redistributed through the members of AFRA, you'll have some sense of, not that I'm a great fan of monetizing everything, but you'll have some sense of what the kind of return on investment for that effort looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually had a social return on investment study undertaken about 3 years ago now by PhD students at Otago University, and her very conservative analysis, which was published in the scientific journal, so, very robust, analysis, showed that for every dollar that gets invested in food rescue, you get about $4.50 worth of social return. And that's made up obviously from feeding people, but it also comes from other benefits that are gained through the activity of food rescue. That includes the volunteer opportunity. A lot of our volunteers come from people who have accessed food rescue. They feel like they want to give something back, or just because they've come into contact with the food rescue organisation, they've realised that there's opportunities from getting more involved. So volunteering for a food rescue organisation is often helps with the pathway to work for people. Um, it's also an opportunity for social engagement for a lot of people who are socially isolated. The other thing that food rescue does is it helps businesses to identify their food waste problem, and the production of unnecessary surplus within their system. Now, this is a bit of a double-edged sword for food rescue because we're helping businesses identify where they can reduce surplus, and often they do as a result. Now, that means that a supply of food dries up. But look, that's a win. That is an environmental win, and especially at the moment, we know that if a source of surplus food dries up, that's not actually too big a problem for us at the moment because there's plenty of other sources of surplus food. But yeah, the activity of food rescue has a wide range of positive impacts beyond just the reduction of food waste and the feeding of hungry people, to a point where we're actually able to quantify a significant return on investment. And as I say, that $4.50 in return for every dollar invested is very, very conservative. And we're actually looking into whether it's time to have that done again, because the whole process of quantifying social return on investment has is developing and growing. And we think if we went through that process again now, we'd probably come up with an even greater return on investment.
And just to understand a bit better what that kind of $4.50 for every dollar invested includes, presumably there's literally what it would cost you to buy that food, or is this um, the outcomes from a child that is able to go to school and concentrate properly because they're not hungry and fidgety, or yeah, where do the boundaries of that kind of return on investment assessment kind of sit?
Yeah, in terms of the purchasing of food, it's more what would the societal cost be
Right.
if food rescue wasn't available. So often, that actually means turning to government assistance to purchase food, which is actually a more expensive way to make sure that person is fed than food rescue. So there's a very clear monetary benefit there. But yes, to your point, it also measures the downstream benefits. If you're preventing cost in the health system and the justice system, by making sure that people are fed. And again, I think the report that we had done probably didn't quantify those things to the extent that we would have liked, because it needed to be verifiable, it needed to be incredibly robust, and that's why we'd love to have a look at it again, because we think as things have progressed, the ability to quantify those things has improved, and we'd probably get an even better outcome.
Yeah. And is there somewhere, if a listener wanted to have a look at that paper, for example, is there a website you could share where that's posted or?
Absolutely. impact.afra.org.nz is where you want to go. But look, head along to the AFRA website, afra.org.nz. You'll find it there. But if you specifically want to go to that report, impact.afra.org.nz.
Thanks, Ian. And I think we need to have a little sidebar here for a moment. There are so many directions this conversation could go in. I knew it was going to be an interesting one that was going to spark all sorts of thoughts. But before we go to any of those things, I think you probably should just explain what the role of AFRA in this food rescue ecosystem, because I clumsily alluded in my introduction to the fact that there are all sorts of community groups, and through some work that you and I have done together, I've got to connect with one of those, and I know of others. There are community groups. It's quite a complex ecosystem, if you like, of people trying to
Mm.
trying to help in this
Um,
space.
Thank you, Roger. I'm really glad. I'm really glad we're doing this. So, AFRA, the Aotearoa Food Rescue Alliance, is an alliance of 35 food rescue organisations. We are all across the country. We're almost in every region of the country. There's a couple of areas where we don't have the footprint that we would like, but just about every part of the country is covered. And as you say, we have a real range of types of community organisations that are members. The thing that they all have in common is they do some form of food rescue. And we are specific about what food rescue is. I think I said this earlier on, but to be clear, food rescue is collecting surplus food that would otherwise go to waste and redistributing it to people in need. So when we talk about the volumes of food rescued, we're not talking about intentional donations, and we're not talking about food which is purchased for charitable purposes. Both fantastic activities, both things that most of our members also do to supplement their food rescue, but we're very clear about the food rescue activity. Now, our members range from the originals like Kibosh in Wellington. You've got a large organisation like Kiwi Harvest in Auckland, Fair Food in West Auckland, Kairos Food Rescue in Christchurch, and they primarily do the actual rescue. They describe themselves as charitable food logistics companies, and that's pretty much what they are. They go into mostly supermarkets, but also other sources, and we'll talk about other sources. They mostly go into supermarkets, collect that surplus food that for whatever reason is not going to be sold, but is still good to eat, take it back to their base, sort it, package it, and then they are distributing it out to other community organisations that are the ones that are doing the front facing work with the people in need, the people who need to be fed. And that can include food banks, it can include women's refuges, it can include schools, include other types of community organisations. So that's probably the core model, that just straight up logistics of collecting, sorting, redistributing out to charitable organisations. Some of our members do that, and then they also have what we call a free store. So a free store is a bit different from a food bank in that it's basically all rescued food, and people come up at designated times and they just queue up and they take the food that they want. So often food banks will say, look, to get food from us, you need to engage with our budgeting services, or you need to be kind of on our books. And free stores very much take the view that by virtue of coming and queuing up, you're demonstrating that you have need. And so we don't really need to know anything else other than that. We'll give you food. And then we've got the other main group that we've got are environmental hubs. So they are doing a whole range of environmentally positive activities, lots of recycling, lots of repair, lots of reuse. And they've got as one of their arms within that ecosystem a food rescue arm. And they might be doing that with a free store, or they might be doing the traditional distribution model. So that by and large is the nature of the organisations that we've got. And as I say, from quite large down to hyper local community organisations, but all having that shared activity of food rescue. So it's a great way of ensuring that food rescue is delivered in a way which is bespoke to the local community, meets the local community's needs, and has the backing of the local community, whilst also having a national voice and a national opportunity for collaboration, developing resources. We don't want as I say, there are regions where we would like to expand the footprint. That might mean a new organisation coming on board. We don't want them to have to reinvent the wheel. We're not precious about our intellectual property or anything like that. We love getting alongside new organisations and small organisations and sharing what the larger, more established organisations have already learned by doing, so that they have a smoother pathway to establishing themselves and being able to deliver for their community.
Thanks. I think it's worth just picking up on the point you've made a couple of times about there being a few gaps or a few areas of the country where you could see there being a need for some more activity. If if a listener, and we do know, and we'll come on to this shortly, we do know that listeners do actually get in touch as a result of listening to this podcast. If a listener was interested in getting in touch with you and saying, "Hey, actually, Ian, this is something I could potentially help with," or at least wanting to find out if there was some activity in their area, how would they go about doing that?
Go to our website, we've got a contact us page, and feel free to use that. You can always email me directly, ian@afra.org.nz. And because I have Scottish ancestry, that's IAIN@afra.org.nz. But yeah, probably the easiest way is go to our website, use the contact page. In most cases, the answer will be yes, there is actually already a food rescue organisation in your area. Uh, they would love you to come and volunteer, or if you're a food producer or a food business, they would love to have a relationship with you, and sit down with you and work out how we can build a relationship. But yes, there might very well be people who are in some of those locations where we're looking for either an existing food bank that wants to step into the food rescue space, or somebody who is interested in stepping up a new charitable organisation to move into that space. Always happy to chat, and as I say, am very, very happy to share knowledge and experiences and to put people in touch with other people who are actually at the front lines doing food rescue work. The whole purpose of our alliance is to share resources and share knowledge, and to make sure that food rescue is being done in the most efficient and effective way possible all across the country.
And what I've observed in our interactions, Ian, is that you seem to me to be extremely respectful of the work that other people are doing and the approach that they're taking, and genuinely are looking only to kind of add value and support to that. So that's just a reflection from the things that we've been working on, which we will come on to in a second. An observation that I often have through these podcasts, and I'm feeling a very profound sense of this today, is just how little I know on the social justice side of food insecurity and the complexity of meeting a whole bunch of, I guess, complex and interacting kind of needs, that I just know so little about it. So thank you for sharing a few insights, and thank you to all of the food rescue and other kind of organizations that are out there trying to support our people. So thank you for that. If we could pivot now to the environmental piece, which is where we started this conversation, your passion to get involved in something that would be more directly impactful in a positive way on the environment. So, what's the scale of the environmental problem with food waste? I mean, whether you want to talk about that globally or within Aotearoa, either's fine.
Yeah, probably easiest to speak globally, and the reason for that is just again the lack of data in New Zealand, and it's a bit of a pitch to anyone who's listening who's got funding available. Is we'd love to do more work in the data space, but we know globally that around a third of all food that is produced ends up wasted or lost from the system. We've got these fine kind of differentiations between food loss and food waste, but ultimately, about a third of all food which is grown for the purpose of being eaten by human beings doesn't end up being eaten by human beings. So if you think about all the inputs that go into growing food, the land that is used, the fertilizers that are applied, the other chemicals that are applied, the fossil fuel use in the growing and the transporting and the retailing of the food, the fact that a lot of that food isn't just lost when it's a whole food, but it's lost after it's been transformed into a product. All the energy and the labor and the knowledge that goes into the transformation into a product. So there's an enormous amount of energy and material inputs that go into the growing of food, which, there is an environmental impact to using those inputs, but, there's a trade-off. The benefit is that people get fed. But if you're using all of those inputs and you're having an impact on the environment to grow that food just for it to go to waste, that's an extraordinarily poor use and poor management of the environment around us. But then just to cap it all off, food waste generates about 8 to 10% of global carbon emissions because food waste generates methane. And we know that methane, although shorter lived in the atmosphere, is much more destructive than carbon dioxide. And so there's a very real and obvious environmental harm being created by food, especially food that ends up in landfill. But even when you're dealing with it in other ways, there is still generation of carbon that ends up in the atmosphere unnecessarily. So that is extraordinary. A third of our food doesn't get eaten. It's generating 8 to 10% of carbon emissions. I suppose you could say this about a lot of things, but if you look at the overall carbon emissions from food waste and you thought of them as a nation, then it would come in third. Behind China and the United States, food waste would come in third behind those two. So it's a huge environmental issue. And so one that we really do need to find ways to tackle. It's complex. The food system is complex. I won't be teaching you anything there, Roger. You'll know that. Food system is complex. We do need to feed people. We do feel that we need food available as and when we need it. And so there's a lot of incentives and drivers there to overproduce and to just kind of accept waste as part of the system. It's part of the way we deliver food and the way we expect it. But it feels very unsustainable. It feels like something that cannot go on for too long without there being some major repercussions. So it is something that there is a global effort going on now to tackle it at all levels, from the production point all the way through to the household, and interventions at all levels of the food chain.
And just to be clear, that 8 to 10% of greenhouse gas emissions from food waste does or doesn't include the emissions associated with producing it. Or
It does. It does.
yeah,
So that's
okay.
that's taking into account all of those. Yeah,
Yeah,
all
okay.
all
Yeah.
of those input emissions. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's still an
Mm.
enormous figure. I just wanted to be clear that that's not just
Yeah.
that isn't just the emissions associated with its decomposition,
No,
basically. No,
no,
no.
that's right.
But still, it's a massive number, and of course, there is always going to be a number. There's always going to be a degree of food waste, as you say. There's all sorts of reasons why a complete zero food waste world seems implausible, but there's a long way to go from naught to 30 percent. Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah. We can make changes that are reasonable and are not going to disrupt our expectations as consumers of food. But I think one of the things that's so important is just raising the awareness around the scale of the problem so that there's more of us demanding change. As I say, it is something which is recognised. Food industry takes this seriously, but the food industry also feels bound to meet what they believe are the expectations of their consumers. So the more consumers who are saying, well, actually, what we're demanding of the food industry is waste reduction and a more sustainable approach, then that'll help encourage the food industry. It'll help show them that there's an incentive to make changes that perhaps they feel at the moment their consumers wouldn't necessarily be on board with.
yeah. And you've alluded already to one of the reasons that we're in this odd situation where in Aotearoa anyway, we have somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 people that experience some form of food insecurity. And on the other hand, we have perhaps in Aotearoa an unquantified amount of our greenhouse gas emissions arising from food waste, but globally it's 8 to 10%. And yes, you've alluded to the complexity of the food system being a contributor to that. What are the other kind of systemic issues going on here? Because when you step back and look at it in those terms, I mean, that's not what anybody would be designing a system to deliver.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of drivers. One of the things is, of course, that food as an export is such an important earner for Aotearoa New Zealand. And that's always going to be the case. And we do not want to change that. We really value the positive economic and social benefits that arise from being able to sell our produce to a global market. But one of the elements of that is a huge focus on value and overproducing in order to meet the demand for the perfect product, the high value product that is going to attract the highest price. And so often, there's a lot of additional food is produced which doesn't meet a quality grade purely on aesthetic judgment. It doesn't mean the food is any less nutritious or less valuable from that point of view, but it has to fit in a box to be packaged and transported, and it has to look just right on the supermarket shelf. And I totally understand why you would want to do that in order to get the best possible price, because we want our food producers to be profitable. We want it to be an activity that sustains people so that people keep doing it. So so that is certainly one of the drivers, that people worry about releasing some of that, in air quotes, inferior quality food into the market in case it has a negative impact on the value of the perfect product. I suppose the other big driver in Aotearoa is we are a low wage, low income economy, but our food prices are generally driven by the global market. Again, we benefit from that, but there is a gap, there is a mismatch between the prices that we are charged in New Zealand and the incomes that people earn. A hot topic at the moment is the price of butter. And I think that really it's a great symbol of the situation. On the one hand, the price of butter is being driven by global dairy prices. Global dairy prices being high is fantastic for our dairy farmers, and our dairy farmers doing well, should, in theory, at least have some positive benefit for their immediate communities and ultimately for the rest of the country. I do note that some of the commentary at the moment is, urban areas are still struggling because the flow-on effect of higher global commodity prices hasn't quite trickled down, dare I say, to use a phrase, to the people in cities. But certainly the price has trickled down to people in cities. So that's a bit of a conundrum that we need to think hard about because, as I say, nobody wants to do farmers out of a decent price and do farmers out of business. And we know that, margins are thin and, and often the price that can be attracted for a commodity doesn't actually cover the price of production. But at the other end of the system are people who can't afford to pay the price. And that goes to a whole bunch of things from our fairly well documented woeful productivity to our labour market settings to our benefit settings. And that's a big conversation that we need to have as a nation. What changes are we actually prepared to make to shift the needle on those things? Because, it's not going to happen overnight. It does require big changes, and it requires changes which are certainly beyond the scope of 35 little charities in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But it's actually something that we all, we need business, we need government, we need community coming together and talking seriously about what the problems are and what are some realistic opportunities to solve those. So, yeah, and to just take a step back and look at things globally, we have a massive concentration of wealth with, the so-called 1%. We have a middle class that's where the gap between what the middle class earns and what we consider to be the necessities for a reasonable middle class lifestyle has widened. And I think food insecurity is one of the signifiers of that. And I spoke earlier about how demand is increasing in Aotearoa. It's increasing from, I suppose, the people that you might traditionally expect to experience food insecurity, especially families that are heavily dependent on a benefit or some kind of income that doesn't come from work. We're increasingly seeing families where they might have two earning adults in the household, but what they are earning is still not enough to pay the bills, put a roof over the family's head, put food on the table. And so they're turning, even if it's just from time to time, they're turning to food rescue. So there's some pretty large societal, economic, and environmental challenges wrapped up in all of that, Roger. And probably a bit beyond the scope of the length of the podcast today. But we're just trying to do our little bit, and we know it is a little bit. And we know that we are primarily dealing with today's issues. So there are people hungry today. There's surplus food today. We're not necessarily solving the big problems, but we are certainly solving the very real and tangible problems that people are experiencing today and hopefully creating a bit of space for the big, big, big conversations to happen about dealing with the drivers of these problems.
And look, I mean, both absolutely need to happen, don't they? If you've got hungry people, hungry kids, they need to be fed now. We also need to have a conversation. We need to recognize that somehow we've ended up with a food system where producers, in many cases, can barely afford to produce that food, even the cost of production, ignoring the fact that often that comes at some environmental cost because of so-called externalities which aren't factored in. In spite of all of that, we have swathes of people across the planet that still can't actually afford to get a really good balanced nutrition within their kind of income. So that's a huge issue. Whilst and I think it's important that we surface that and we recognise that that's an issue, whilst at the same time the work that you and AFRA members are doing to resolve the immediate problem critically important.
Look, to put it in business terms, ultimately, we need our consumers to be able to afford to buy the products that are created and to be able to afford to pay a price that creates a reasonable standard of living for the people who are producing the food. And I might be exposing some of my biases here, but I think they're probably pretty well known anyway. there's only so much food that the 1% need to eat. And so they can only spend so much on food. And maybe if a little bit more of that wealth was distributed a little bit more evenly around the world, our consumers might be able to afford to pay a decent price for food, to be nourished, to be able to put food on the table, and for our growers to be able to have a sustainable lifestyle as well.
So, thank you very much indeed, Ian. We have navigated, I think, one of the curliest questions, if not the curliest question, kind of facing humanity right now, actually, how we feed ourselves within planetary boundaries in a fair, enjoyable, environmentally restorative way. All the rest of the questions are nowhere near that curly. The thing that we really need to talk about, which is very straightforward, is just to share with listeners a bit of the work that we've been doing together in this food rescue space and how we came to meet. Do you want to
Hmm,
kick off?
I'll kick off. Well, the good news is that it all started with this podcast, Roger. So a neighbor of mine was listening to your podcast and thought, he sounds very sensible. He's doing some interesting work. And this neighbor of mine by the name of Rachel Blacker, I'm sure Rachel won't mind being name dropped, has past experience with food rescue. She's a US citizen and so a relatively recent migrant to Aotearoa. And back in the US, she was working with a food rescue organization. So she knew a bit about food rescue. And by virtue of us living in the same street, our kids went to the same primary school. And in a typical American fashion, Rachel is not afraid of just wandering up to people and introducing herself. And she'd seen some of my posts on LinkedIn, was aware of my association with food rescue, and so accosted me at a school assembly. And we had a couple of conversations, and she mentioned that she'd been listening to your podcast and just wondered if there was an opportunity for AFRA and Plant and Food Research to work together. And as you'll recall, that ended up when you and I having a conversation, which initially was just about could we get access to some of the food that is grown by Plant and Food Research for your research means is any of that available for redistributing for charitable purposes? And you educated me that there was already some of that going on, but we talked about the possibility of actually, getting some of that fruit that wasn't being harvested and, getting it off the trees or the vines or out of the ground and into the charitable food supply chain. And I thought I always go back to towards the end of the conversation, you kind of went, "Oh, is there any chance that you could rustle up some volunteers for this? Because, we've already got our staff kind of doing this in their lunch breaks, but it would really work best if there's a way of you getting some more people into this work." And the penny sort of dropped very heavily in my mind that this was a space that we really wanted to get into, something that sometimes gets called gleaning, but which we're increasingly called second harvest, which is where groups of volunteers go in and harvest food from orchards, from gardens, potentially from farms as well. Um, that for a whole variety of reasons, in your case, because it's been grown for research purposes, not for feeding people purposes, is never even going to get harvested in the first place. And it's an area that we wanted to move into. And so suddenly we were talking about, well, can we use the opportunity to harvest food from plant and food research as an opportunity to demonstrate best practice, to learn a bit about how we do this well, and to basically run a pilot to see if we can create, a body of evidence and some case studies to support the scaling up of second harvest work around Aotearoa. Because, as I said, primarily our organisations work with supermarkets and other retailers, sometimes with cafes and bakeries and what have you, but primarily, they go to those sources of surplus food because they're in their communities. It's an easy place to get food from. But I've said there isn't a lot of data about the New Zealand context, but we know globally there's probably actually more food being lost at the producer level than there is at the retail level. And there's lots and lots of really lovely, nutritious, fresh, straight off the tree, off the vine, out of the ground food that could potentially be being repurposed for charitable uses that at the moment is, maybe getting plowed back into the ground or going to feed pigs and or just falling off the tree and rotting, yeah, on site. And because you're a wonderful human being and Planted Food Research is an amazing organization, you guys have been just incredibly helpful in running an initial pilot this year at your Te Puke site with our member, the Hub Te Puke, where we've been able to work together to do a bit of kiwi fruit harvesting. And in just a couple of sessions with very few volunteer hours needing to be put in, we've been able to safely, efficiently, and effectively harvest quite a decent amount of kiwi fruit that was then redistributed into the Bay of Plenty community to help feed hungry people. So that's my version of the story, Roger. I'd love to hear your version of it.
Yeah, all of that, and I mean, it was about in the end getting on for 4 tons of kiwi fruit that was able to be redistributed. I think for me, there's some complexity in organising this in the sense that these are research orchards. Much of the fruit is perfectly fit for human consumption, but we need to be careful that we're making sure the volunteers are only picking from those rows of vines that are suitable to be picked. There's all the issues of weather and managing to get volunteers on site when the weather's good and the fruit's in good condition and so on. We managed to navigate all of that. We were building on what my colleagues have been doing for some time. So there's particularly at Te Puke, but at some of our other sites, there's quite a long history of working with local food rescue organisations to try and collect some of that fruit. The difference here is two important differences. One, potentially the scale that we could operate at with the volunteers from the food rescue organisations, because our people have done as literally as you said in their kind of lunch breaks or after work. So being able to scale it that way, and secondly, being really careful in documenting how we do it, the induction process, the health and safety issues, the food safety considerations, and having that all really clearly documented so we can share it with anybody else who is interested in having a go at this kind of second harvest concept, if they have a farm or an orchard that they're interested in trying this out on. And I'm really looking forward to the guide. And this wasn't a setup job, but the guide that AFRA are putting together that talks about second harvest and the experiences of some of your members in doing second harvesting, and including this pilot trial that we ran at Te Puke. And I know you're looking to launch that at some point in September. So that will be a great way of pulling all of that experience together. And just to kind of round out that conversation, it's been really interesting for me personally to begin to get some deeper insights into the food rescue scene in New Zealand and to understand some of these interacting social issues more deeply. And until this conversation, to be honest, Ian, I hadn't really quite seen the nexus of environmental impact and social justice in quite the same way as I do now. So thank you for sharing that with me. Just conscious of time, we now need to pivot again in this conversation and just kind of land the podcast a bit. So I'm interested in if you've got some suggestions. You've already hinted at this, but any listeners who are interested in getting involved in any dimension of food rescue, how they might make a start on that?
Look, the easiest way to start is to make contact with your local food rescue organization. And if you don't know who that is, once again, doing a lot of heavy lifting today is the AFRA website, afra.org.nz. We have a members page on there. You can see where our members are located around the country, and you find your local member, just reach out to them, find out what they need in terms of whether it's volunteers, whether it's food supply, whether it's help with distribution, yeah, they're always looking for more support. Certainly, one thing we haven't talked a lot about today is ultimately, yeah, the biggest need in the charitable sector is money. All our organizations have costs. None of this stuff can be done for free. We certainly do it very efficiently with a lot of volunteer labor, but having vehicles, refrigerated vehicles to maintain cold chain, fridges and freezers, warehouses, some paid staff to coordinate everything, electricity, internet, all of that sort of thing, it all costs money. And so donations, whether they be individual donations or if you're able to, if you're a business and you're able to make a more corporate level donation, those are always welcome by our local members as well. And of course, if you're a food business and you think that there might be some opportunity to have a partnership with your local food rescue organisation, again, please do reach out. We are, yeah, one of the things I often do is just a bit of matchmaking, putting people in contact with the right person to get that conversation rolling as quickly as possible. So just, have a look at our website, reach out to us. Even if you're not sure, you've just kind of got an inkling of an idea that there might be some opportunity, please do get in contact with us. We can tease it out and see if there's something there.
Thanks. And I can include the AFRA website address in the information that goes with this podcast when it's published. When you were talking, then, Ian, I was wondering, would it be useful? This shows my bias around energy and renewable energy in particular. If somebody had a rush of blood and wanted to install solar panels on one of these hubs where you've got maybe quite a lot of refrigeration and freezing kit to store this food, or possibly even somebody with a spare electric truck for the distribution side of things. I mean, is that the kind of thing you'd be interested in as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. All of those things make a big difference. And quite often that is how support comes about. It's a food business offering a piece of plant and equipment that is of no longer of use to them, but could be of use to the food rescue organisation. Yeah, any of those sorts of things would are potentially very useful. So again, as I say, if you just kind of got a completely random idea, you're not even sure if it's helpful or not, please do let us know. We can try and work out a way to make use of the contribution that you can make.
I mean, anybody out there that's interested in that 4.5 to 1 return on investment, yeah, Ian's the person to get in touch with. Now, personal question for you: is there a book or a podcast or poem or a film? Is there something out there that you have found particularly useful or inspiring that you'd like to take the opportunity to share with other people?
I'm a big podcast listener. That's how I get the chores done, like a lot of people, is listening to podcasts. And a couple that I suspect probably a lot of listeners have come across, but a couple that I find really informative are the Circular Economy Show podcast from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which absolutely does exactly what it says on the tin. It's got lots of experts talking about practical ways that we can help build a circular economy, whether that's things that you do at home or as a private individual, and also systemic things that we need to be talking about at a corporate and government level as well. And here in Aotearoa, one that I listen to a lot is this climate business with Vincent Herringer, really talking a lot about the opportunities that lie in solving the climate crisis. And yeah, trying to look at what is a can feel like a daunting existential theory at times in a more optimistic and positive light to look at where where the opportunities lie. So and Vincent has a wide array of guests, and if you look back about a year and a half or so ago, you might even find yours truly and Caitlin Dawson from New Zealand Food Waste Champions talking about food waste and the opportunities that lie in tackling that problem.
Well, thanks for coming and sharing your wisdom on this podcast as well today. And final kind of question for you: if you had one superpower to make the world a better place, to hold open the possibility of future generations of humans prospering, what would that superpower be?
Goodness, yeah, this is a tricky one. I think superpower that we all need and if I had the superpower to grant this for everybody, would be awesome, is the ability to treat longer term threats and longer term challenges as in the same way that we do short term immediate challenges, to see them as urgent and to see the threats and the opportunities in the same way. It's evolution, right? We are hardwired to deal with the immediate threat, and so we often put the longer term challenges aside and kick the can down the road whilst we deal with the immediate. But that is eventually going to catch up with us. And it would be wonderful if we could deviate from type and deal with a couple of these big crises before they cause massive disruption. So that would be the superpower I would like to have, or to impart on others, is to be able to treat the future in the same way that we treat the present.
And you alluded to this, but I think we're also hardwired to think a lot about the possibilities, for example, of a new technology, much less consideration of the potential risks. That just seems to be the way we, as a species, look at things, and that's
Well, it's
I
good to
think
be
get us in.
optimistic, but but we do need to, yeah, we do need to weigh the risk and reward
Yeah.
in as balanced and rational way as we possibly can, being the emotional beings that we are.
Indeed, indeed. Look, it's been a fantastic conversation this morning. I was very much looking forward to it, and it hasn't disappointed at all. Have you given me a cause for hope? Well, yes, of course, just working with you and Rachel and my colleagues on this particular project has been a real kind of high point over the last year, or kind of 18 months, really, for me. So, yes. Have you issued a call to action for me and to listeners? Well, yes, in spades. So, thank you for that. And real tangible stuff that people could get involved in all sorts of different ways. So, I really appreciate that. And I just want to kind of wrap up by acknowledging that what we've talked about in terms of this particular pilot project around second harvest is very much a build on what a lot of people have been doing for some time, and very much in the spirit of what I see you doing. All we're trying to do here is amplify and build on good stuff and make a useful contribution. So so that's been really good. For listeners out there, thank you so much for listening to this episode of my podcast series. I hope you have enjoyed listening to it as much as I've enjoyed chatting to Iain. If you're interested in more of these sort of conversations about people, planet, and food, please subscribe to Sigest and rate and review this show, which is really helpful for us. And share a link to it with anybody else you think might be interested. That's also super helpful. And if you think of a person or a topic that you think should be covered on this series, please get in touch. And the episode today is living proof that that happens and it can make a difference. So thank you for listening. And thank you very much again, Iain, for your time this morning, your insights, and for dealing with what I alluded to as being, I think, one of the curliest questions that humanity has to deal with.
Oh, well, look, thank you very much, Roger, for the opportunity to share the amazing work that our members do. And I really do want to finish by acknowledging our member organisations and the people working in them. They are the ones doing the real work. I get this lovely job of sharing the stories, but there are thousands of people volunteering in food rescue. There's people who are getting paid, but not a lot, to run these organisations and do this incredibly important mahi in our communities. And I really just want to acknowledge them for the tremendous effort and the difference that they make every single day.
What a good note to finish on. Thanks, Iain. Kia ora.